All right, what I wanted to do today is start, at least for a few days, to talk about problems of science and religion. There's a great deal to be said about this, and I'm just skimming off the top. I think a few points can be made that will at least give you the flavor of our approach, our attitude, and at least mean that if other problems arise, you'll at least feel it's worthwhile to check carefully whether we have some responses to those questions as well. Let's start with the age of the universe. There is some difference between the current scientific estimate of 13.8 billion years and the Jewish date of 5744. Some gap there between the two, about 10 orders of magnitude. What could possibly be said about that? Well, the one point that I want to make to you, and I want to illustrate in detail, is all projections about the past are made on the basis of a key assumption. That key assumption is that the laws of nature that we see operating now have always operated in the same way. If you don't make that assumption, then you can't draw any conclusions certainly about the remote past. Now, Maimonides faced a similar problem. In his time, it was much worse in qualitative terms. We're talking about 13.8 billion. He was facing the Aristotelians who said the world is infinitely old. Infinitely old with no beginning, which indeed every scientific and philosophically trained person believed until 1965. The world has no beginning at all. And he was around 4,700, 1,000 years ago. There was a big discrepancy, an infinite discrepancy. Maimonides put his point this way. He said, imagine a boy who's born, and after a few months his mother dies, and his father takes him to a community of only men. And he grows up. And when he becomes mature and starts inquiring about the world, he asks the adults in that community, where did we come from? We people. And the answer he gets is, well, there are others that are very much like us, but different in some respects. We all start out as tiny miniatures inside the abdomens of one of those others, where we are for a number of months, and then we exit, and then we grow to look as you see us. So the child asks, tell me, when we are miniatures inside the abdomens of those others, can we breathe? And the answer is no. Can we eat? The answer is no. Can we drink? The answer is no. So the child says, well, then what you're telling me has to be wrong. It has to be wrong. We all know that if you don't breathe for 4 minutes, you're dead. If you don't drink for 2 weeks, you're dead. If you don't eat for 2 months, you're dead. We know that. Experience teaches us that. Every creature in the world that you see has that property. And you're telling me that we're inside the abdomen of that other for months and months without breathing, without eating, without drinking? What you're telling me has to be false. And he's right about his world, the world that he knows, the world that he's seen and experienced. What's being described to him is impossible. What he doesn't know is that there's an entirely different state of being, entirely different structure of existence, which is entirely different from what he knows. And in that state of being, in that structure, these things are possible. He just doesn't know about that. Maimonides says that what we call the 6 days of creation are the gestation of the world. They're the world in embryo. They're the world of a fetus before birth. And just like the life of the fetus in the womb is different fundamentally from the life after birth, so the existence of the universe and its operation and its rules before our section of history, before the end of the 6 days, is entirely different or very different from what it is post 6 days. The laws that we observe in operation in our universe start at the end of the 6th day of creation and carry on thereafter. So, if we're going to use the laws that we see, to project back beyond the end of the sixth day, the projection is going to be incompetent, irrelevant, and immaterial. It's not going to apply to the reality, because the rules governing the way the world functioned in those 6 days are extremely different. I won't say totally different, but extremely different from the way the rules operate in our section of history post the 6 days of creation, which we call the laws of nature. And by the way, it isn't only Maimonides who says so, but Paul Dirac, maybe you've heard of him, one of the great physicists of the 20th century, said essentially the same thing, not from a religious point of view, but he said that the laws of nature are evolving. Laws of nature are not constant. And therefore, projecting back to the early history of the universe is not competent, because we don't know what the laws were at that time. We don't know how they were changing. We don't know how they got into the operation that we have observed. So once you know that projecting back 13.8 billion years requires assuming that the laws have been constant throughout, and that's an assumption. And it's an assumption for which there's no evidence. It's just an assumption. That being the case, we can say to the scientific community, you have a methodology. Your methodology sometimes is to make assumptions because they're simple or natural or conservative or whatever, and follow out the consequences of those assumptions. Fine. It's a free world. Anybody can dedicate himself to whatever discipline he wants, whatever investigation he wants, but I don't have to roll over and play dead because of your assumptions. You just made that assumption. Now, having said that, I think that's an unassailable argument. Having said that, I'll add one more point to the description, then we'll stop for discussion. If you ask, well, what about all of the evidence of greater age? What should we do about it? How should we think about it? I'll give you a way to think about it. This was authored by Rabbi Shimon Schwab, and it's certainly one kosher way to think about it from our point of view. There are others, but since this is psychologically most familiar and comforting to people, I'm presenting that. I don't think it's philosophically any better than the alternatives, but people find it more comforting, so I'm presenting it. I'm saying that out up front. It's being recorded twice, and I'm doing this for psychological reasons, but it's certainly logically fully adequate. Shimon Schwab says that everything that the scientific world catalogs as events in the history of the universe all took place. They all took place. It's just that almost all of them took place much faster. Much faster. Millions of times faster. Maybe up to hundreds of millions or billions of times faster. The 6 days of creation are 6 24-hour periods. To cram in all those events, pterodactyls and all, to cram them all in, you just have to speed it up. You'll tell me, says Rabbi Schwab, that if I speed it up, I'm going to be breaking laws of nature, material science and the speed of light and all the rest. And he says, yes, that's right. The laws of nature are not being observed during that period of time. I don't remember that he quotes Maimonides, but I'm sure he had Maimonides in mind when he wrote that. So that you can accept the entire description of the history of the universe that the scientific community presents, just we understand that it was greatly speeded up, and in that way we can account for all the appearances, and we can put them into our frame. That's one way to handle the creation of the universe. Questions up to here? Yeah.
It's like radiocarbon dating. You would say that the laws were in effect based on our creation of 6 days.
You know, carbon dating, everybody's heard of carbon dating. Carbon dating is really trivial. The most anyone uses it for is about 50,000 years. It's known to be off typically by 10%, and it's based on certain assumptions, but uranium and potassium argon dating is much better than that. It goes for millions of years, and there's the redshift of the light and so forth and so on. There are other ways of setting up the dating, but all of them depend upon the constancy of the laws of nature. The speed of light has to be the same speed. Only then can you calculate how long it took the light to get from a distant star to us. And then you can calculate the distance, only if the speed is the same speed. And the same thing's true with for any radioactive decay. You have a half-life, follows a half-life law. Half-life law says over a certain period of time, half of the radioactive atoms will decay. And it's the same half-life. If it's a million-year half-life, if you had 1,000, after a million years you'll have 500, and after another million years you have 250, another million years of 125, goes down by half. That's got to be constant. Otherwise you can't calculate backwards how long it's been from the times when it was a pure radioactive collection. Yeah.
So if we're operating under the presumption that the way in which we experience the world was different prior to the seventh day, essentially, can we not say that the previous days just weren't what we deem as 24-hour days? Could there not be just like almost a conversion formula? And I say that based on something that I read from a solid source, in my opinion, a PhD from MIT, who basically says that the way in which you measure the time can, if you have like a rate, distance in time, you can measure time by the inverse.
Schroeder.
Yeah,
exactly.
I only know Schroeder's first book, but I don't think you're quoting him correctly. I don't think you're quoting his point correctly.
I'm not trying to.
Okay, so what you started to say is totally independent of any scientific credentials or background.
Correct.
Has been suggested many, many times.
Right.
And that has one status, and his scientific work has a different status entirely. There
My
are
question
two different.
is 2 parts.
Okay, good. I'll take both of them. The idea that the word day in the description of Genesis stands for eras, epochs, much longer periods of time is possible. It is possible. That is to say, if you're reading the book, just the book itself, and you're trying to understand it, it is a possible way to look at the book. But for us, the book doesn't stand on its own. The book is embedded in a tradition. Almost every commentator that we have over the last 1,000 years says 6 days is 6 24-hour periods. Particular Maimonides and Nachmanides, the two great pillars of Jewish thought, both say so explicitly. So we are not going to be able to use that as a way out. Even if now I'm going to say something a little subtle, even if it's controversial, let's say there are authorities who say that they're 6 24-hour periods, and others who say that they are longer epochs. Scientific research is not going to determine which one of them is right. That's not the way the tradition interprets itself. It does not interpret itself on the basis of scientific findings. The way in which that dispute is expressed, and if it could be adjudicated, would be adjudicated on the basis of understanding our own sources. So we're not subject to that kind of resolution of the conflict on the grounds that current observations and theory lead to support one side rather than the other. So we're not able to take that way out in terms of interpreting it as eras or epochs, number one. But his work, Schroeder's work, is designed to show that there are different ways of measuring time. And in one way of measuring time, 6 24-hour periods is true. Still true. And another way of measuring it, it could be, now when he started to do it, it's 15 billion, now it's 13.8 billion, so you have to adjust the figures somehow. It could be 13.8 billion, which would mean that the Torah is describing one genuine time period, and the other is describing a different genuine time period. That's not at all the suggestion that we just discussed. The suggestion we just discussed is 13.8 billion, period, and day there doesn't mean 24-hour period at all. It only means longer epochs. That's a one-dimensional view. The view that you're discussing is one that has 2 dimensions, 2 different ways to measure time. One is the time measurement of the book, and the other is the time measurement of science. And that's why they're not in conflict, because they're different ways of measuring time. I don't accept his conclusions. I don't accept his reasoning. The first book I have detailed criticisms of on my website. There are others who have criticized as well. I've not gone to the later books. I'm not confident of this whole method. But I'm not going to go through what he says, why I don't agree with it. And since we have a way of handling it without resorting to interpretations of contemporary science, I think we're in a position where we don't have to worry about the problem already.